talk a little bit about how church is going to be over the next few weeks. As Teresa announced, next week I am going to be taking some vacation time to spend with my parents while they are here. And so we have invited Mickey Carver to come and speak on that Sunday. But the following 2 weeks will also be a little different. The week after that, we are going to have the group coming back from camp, and they're going to be sharing about what has happened at camp. We're going to have some of the students share. Cheyenne, as the leader, is going to share. She's going to love that. For anybody who knows, my wife hates being up here and talking in front of people, so she's willing to do it, but she's not happy about it. So we're going to be hearing about what happened from camp the following week. The week after that, as many of you know, I have a relatively minor heart condition that causes my heart rate to periodically click into a much higher rate than it should. Its fancy name is tachycardia, and I'm actually scheduled to have a procedure done on the 31st of this month to fix it. They're going to essentially shoot lasers at my heart until it stops, until the problem stops, not until my heart stops, hopefully at least. So I'm not allowed to die. So, so with that, I am going to be recovering that week. So one of our board members, Paul, is actually going to be bringing the word that first Sunday of August. As of right now, the plan is for me to be back the following week. As long as all goes well, my recovery time should be relatively short. So if anything happens, if there are any complications, we'll let you guys know and we'll adjust as needed. But for right now, I should only miss that 1 week in August, and then I should be back after that with a heart that works normally, hopefully. So that's the plan for us moving forward for the next few weeks. So today we are going to be continuing on in the book of Judges. We are going to be looking at Judges chapter 14. Last week we were introduced to Samson. Samson is one of the most well-known figures in the entire book of Judges. There's more written about him than any other judge in the book. Samson was meant not only to be a judge, but a Nazirite, as we learned about last week. And a Nazirite is someone who is dedicated to God and his service. Someone who would be dedicated to God for a certain period of time. But for Samson, he was going to be a Nazirite from his birth to his death. Samson was meant to deliver the people of Israel from the Philistines, who had been oppressing them for 40 years already. So important was the calling that was put on his life that even his parents had to be informed of it before his birth so they could raise him properly. Samson should have been a great beacon of hope to the people of Israel, just as the previous judges had been. And while we will see that God is clearly with Samson in great and powerful ways, Samson is also a man who is plagued by his own poor decision-making and constantly falls victim to his own fleshly desires. Anybody who's familiar with the story of Samson knows about the great failure that happens towards the end of Samson's life. But what we are going to be learning about today shows that big failure that Samson has doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen all at once. It is a process that starts all the way back here in Judges 14 with small little compromises that get Samson just off the mark and just off the mark and just off the mark enough that he is prepared, primed, and ready to make that big failure later down the road. He does great things for God and for his people over the course of his life. But he is also a man that can be selfish, willfully ignorant, foolish, and even cruel. We too are called to be beacons of light in a world of darkness, just as Samson was. Sure, we may fall victim to our own failings, just as Samson does, but that doesn't mean that we cannot or should not still live our lives dedicated to God's service. We should take pride, not in ourselves, but in our God, and allow his will to become our will. The more we put our focus on God, the more we can diminish our own failings and instead begin to live more and more for him. Samson is a very complex individual. His story is fascinating, which I believe is why there is so much time dedicated to it. Now, the first story that we read of Samson as a grown man, as I said, highlights one of Samson's greatest weakness, that being his weakness when it comes to women. In his desire for women that he finds desirable, he does something that is all too common. He compromises. Now, that might not sound like a bad thing when I say it like that. You may say, I thought we should compromise, especially when it comes to our relationships, especially when it comes to relationships with men and women. Isn't compromise in marriage a good thing? Isn't compromise in general a good thing? And I would say in a great many areas, compromise is indeed a good thing. However, there are areas where compromise becomes dangerous. One of those areas is when it comes to your relationship with God. It is also dangerous when it comes to the calling that God has put on your life. In the story that we are about to read, Samson makes small little compromises in both of these areas, and they take him down a path that is going to lead to his eventual destruction. Now, the first compromise that Samson makes is one concerning the mission that God has given him. And we find it quickly in Judges chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. Samson's a grown man, and as many men before and after him, he desires a wife. In doing this, he goes against the custom of the day, which was to marry within the nation of Israel. They are warned about the dangers of intermarrying with non-believing people around them, and outright forbidden to marry within 7 of the surrounding nations because of their great evil. But Samson goes against this custom and against this tradition because he allows his lust to get the better of him. In Judges 14, beginning in verse 1, it says, Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all of my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So Samson sees this woman and decides that he must have her. And the fact that she comes from the very nation that is oppressing his people makes no difference to him at all, apparently. The fact that she belongs to a nation that he is chosen to deliver the people of God from doesn't make a difference to him. This is supposed to be his enemy. These are the enemies of the people of God. And he's like, I don't care. I just want to marry this woman. He sees her. He wants her. So he demands that she be his. Even though his parents object to this desire because they see that this decision is not going to serve him well, either in drawing him closer to God or preparing him for his fight against the Philistines. In fact, it would likely hinder both of those things. Samson's parents knew of his calling to deliver Israel from the Philistines, and I am sure that they had shared this calling with Samson himself. Now that he is an adult, instead of creating distance between himself and the enemies of his people that he has been called to deliver his people from, he is instead seeking to make bonds with these people. From the very beginning, this seems like an unwise plan. I would say certainly unwise, but not technically against any rules. As I said earlier, the Israelites were discouraged from intermarrying with the people around them, since this could possibly draw them away from God and toward the false gods of the people around them. But in the exception of 7 nations, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and the Perizzites, you were allowed to marry with the other nations. It was those 7 that you weren't allowed to marry with. But nowhere in that list do we find the Philistines. So Samson isn't doing anything that's expressly against the rules. He wasn't crossing any lines. However, he was creeping closer to a line. Had the Philistines not been oppressing the people of God, and had they not been the nation that God had told Samson to defeat, this may not have been as bad of a decision for him. But given the circumstances, this is undoubtedly morally weak and spiritually questionable for Samson to be doing. If there are people that are openly opposed to the things of God, as the Philistines were at this time, it would be foolish for us to seek to create and foster bonds with those people. I'm not saying that we should have nothing to do with them at all, since they are still sinners in need of a Savior. So we can still minister to them, but there's a big difference between witnessing to someone and marrying them. I generally do not allow people that I witness to or minister to the same level of influence in my life as I do my close friends, let alone my wife. Yet our desires can make us want to make those little compromises because we think that the reward is worth it. Samson is very willing to make this little compromise when it comes to the mission that God has given to him because of his own lust. He wants this woman, so he doesn't care what it could mean for him moving forward. If you allow your fleshly desires to blind you so much that you don't even stop to think about how this decision could impact your future or your relationship with God, you have allowed your desires to put you in great danger. In verses 5 through 9, Samson is continuing to pursue this woman in spite of the warnings of his parents, and he's traveling to meet with her. And while he is doing this, he is attacked by a lion. And this is the first mention of the thing most people think of when they think of Samson, his great strength. He is able to overcome the lion, and as he travels back and forth, he encounters the lion's body again. And in so doing, he makes another small compromise, this time when it comes to the vow that he had made. In Judges 14, beginning in verse 5, it says, "So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. After some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hands and went along eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion." So now this is a feat of great strength. It must have been supernatural. There's no other way to describe it. A man being attacked even by an adolescent lion, a young lion as it was described here, winning that encounter for a man is not good. I don't care how big and strong you think you are not taking down a lion, much less with your bare hands and ripping it apart. This shows that God is with him, since he empowered Samson to protect himself from the attacking lion. Now, I want to tell you, there are going to be times in your life where you feel overwhelmed by the things that are coming against you. You may feel like you are staring down a lion, but know in those moments that God is with you, and he has the strength to overcome anything that comes against you. And even as he empowered Samson to rip apart this young lion, he can empower you to get past the obstacles in your life. Now, this lion becomes important for more reasons than just an example of Samson's great strength. It also becomes the subject of a riddle that Samson will put to the people because as he comes across this carcass later, he sees a colony of bees has taken up residence there, and he takes some of the honey so he can have a treat as he travels. How Samson deals with this lion once again shows his compromising nature. Now, I want to be clear, he did nothing wrong in killing the lion. That was self-defense. But the way he dealt with it afterwards is questionable, to say the least. He goes back to see this carcass. The Bible even says that he turned aside to see it, meaning that he had to go out of his way. He wanted to see this lion that he had killed again. I totally understand this desire as a man. If I'd killed a lion with my bare hands, I'd want to go and see it too. I'd want to relive that moment. But there's one very big difference between Samson and me. Well, I mean, there's more than one difference. Obviously, I don't have the long hair. I don't have the great strength. But I'm talking about the big difference that I'm referring to is that Samson had taken a vow, a Nazirite vow. And part of that vow was not to be around dead bodies. So you may ask, did Samson break his vow here? He was around a dead body, the body of the lion. Now, some biblical scholars would say yes. But it's unclear whether the prohibition in the Nazirite vow when it came to dead bodies was specifically human remains or animals as well. Now, unless Nazirites were vegetarians, this wouldn't be the case. It would be purely against human remains. So it was likely limited to human remains. But even if this is the case, this is once again Samson drawing near to a line, but not necessarily crossing it, doing something that's unwise, yet still allowed. You would think that if you were tasked with not being around dead bodies of people, that you would think I should probably stay away from dead bodies in general. But this is not what Samson does. He's now drawing near to this lion carcass that's now been rotting in the sun for days and has bugs now taking up residence in it. And not only that, but Jewish law said that if you approached a corpse, even the corpse of an animal in this manner, you would be considered unclean until the evening. So he may not have been breaking his special vow that he made with God, but he was doing something that made him unclean. And he does this seemingly very lightly, as though he doesn't care at all. This once again shows that Samson is often more absorbed with his selfish desires than with what God has called him to do. To be clear, I'm not saying that Samson was 100% clearly wrong here. This is one of those gray areas. And we're presented with those gray areas on a regular basis. Something that may not be expressly forbidden, but we also know isn't really great for us either. Like an alcoholic hanging out in a bar. It's not against the law, you're not breaking any rules, but it's probably not a smart thing for you to be doing. Or someone who struggles with lust deciding that, I'm going to order that magazine and I'm going to look at those bikini pictures. It's not anything wrong. I'm not breaking the law. I'm not doing anything that I shouldn't be doing, but I'm kind of getting close to that line that I know I really shouldn't be near. Anytime we take those actions that are kind of gray, we know they're not wise, but they're not expressly against the rules. Every time we take those actions, we draw ourselves nearer and nearer to that line of sin. These unwise yet allowed actions will bring you closer to actions that would be sinful. And for that purpose, you just are seeking to satisfy your own selfish desires. You're trying to get closer to that line of sin without crossing over it and actually sinning, and you're doing it because it feels good. You're like a junkie trying to get a fix. You're like, I need that drug, but I can't really take the drug, so I'm going to get as close as I can, and I want to feel that rush without actually touching it. If you get so comfortable with those gray decisions, those unwise but allowed decisions, and you keep doing those like Samson is here, we begin to think that I do this thing and nothing bad happens. Maybe next time I can go just a bit further. Samson's heart was, I want to see how close I can get to that line without getting myself into trouble. But our heart shouldn't be to see how close we can get to the line. Our heart should instead be to see how far away I can get from that line. If you are the type of person that wants to push the envelope, that wants to get as close to that line of sin as you can without actually touching it, just so you can satisfy some urge that you have, it will end with you falling into sin. I'm telling you, it's not a question of if, it is a question of when. You cannot flirt with that line of sin, try to get as close as you can and reach your hand out and say, I'm not going to touch it, but I'm going to get as close as I can. If you keep doing that, I promise you, you are going to cross that line. You are going to touch that sin one day or another. But Samson is a man that's mostly concerned with satisfying his desires, first and foremost. That's most important to him. In verses 10 through 14, he's working towards satisfying another, this one being his marriage to this Philistine woman that he desires. And before the wedding ceremony, there's this week-long feast, as was the custom of the day. And a group of men from the community come together to make up Samson's wedding party. And he makes a bet with this group of men and puts a riddle to them. In Judges 14, beginning in verse 10, it says, So his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there, for young men used to do so. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. Then Samson said to them, "Let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing." And they said to him, "Pose your riddle that we may hear it." So he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. So Samson is using his experience with the lion as the basis for this riddle. Now this is a little bit more of the questionable character on his part coming out, because he's using an experience that he has had, and the scripture specifically says he hasn't told anybody about it. He's essentially tricked them into this no-win bet, because there's no way they could know what he was talking about. But they entered into it willingly, for I'm sure they thought that they could get one over on Samson. I mean, there's 30 of them, and they've got 7 days to figure it out. I'm sure they were certain that no matter what riddle he put forward, they would solve it. And the risk was far greater for Samson than it was for these 30 men, as he would have to come up with 30 garments if he lost. Yet each of them would only have to come up with one if they lost. Each side thinks they're pulling a fast one on the other. I think the best lesson that we can learn from all this is don't try to trick one another into these kinds of no-win situations. You know, it's one thing if it's between friends and it's all in good fun, but as we're about to see in verses 15 through 20, this is not between friends, and it is not all in good fun. As the days tick away, this group of 30 men is becoming increasingly nervous about losing the bet. Now, rather than taking it in stride and just taking the loss and say, you know what, let's just consider it a wedding gift to the groom, instead, they decide to make threats. But they don't make threats to Samson. Instead, they go after his soon-to-be wife. In Judges 14, beginning in verse 15, it says, "But it came to pass on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife, 'Entice your husband, that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so?' Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, 'You only hate me. You do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me.' And he said to her, 'Look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you?' Now she had wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the 7th day that he told her, because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, 'What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?' And he said to them, 'If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle.' Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. And Samson's wife had been given to his companion, who had been his best man." Now, first and foremost, this shows that these men, these 30 men, are not friends of Samson. In fact, they are Philistines, the very people he was meant to fight against. But yet he seems more interested in becoming friends with them, making bets and having fun. Yet circumstances are about to force his hand, and open hostilities between him and the Philistines were about to break out. These men decide that they are going to make threats against this woman, that they're going to destroy her father's house. They then complain about the potential loss of clothes, which, side note, you probably shouldn't bet at all, but if you do, only bet what you're willing to lose. This woman, out of fear of these men and clearly little, if any, loyalty to Samson, goes right into nagging him to find the answer to the riddle. She complains and whines and manipulates him and eventually wears him down over the course of the days. On this subject, let me read a verse to you. It's Proverbs 21:9, and it deals with this particular issue that Samson found him in quite well. Proverbs 21:9 says, "Better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman." So let me tell you, women, don't be like this. Don't make your husband want to hide on the roof of your house just to get away from you because you are so nagging. And men, stay away from women like this. I don't care how pretty she is. That kind of behavior just isn't worth it. They will drive you crazy. And as Samson will find out on more than one occasion, they can even bring ruin into your life. In summary, women, don't be nagging. And men, stay away from women who do. All right, rant over, we're going to move on. Now, Samson is clearly furious at this betrayal. And apparently God was with him, since it said the Spirit of God came upon him, and he was able to go and kill 30 of their countrymen in order to pay his debt. To make matters even worse, when he returns from this endeavor, he finds that the woman that he has gone through all this trouble to be with had been given to his best man while he was away. When we seek to bind ourselves to the world, as Samson did here, it will only result in disaster because of the difference in ideology between the world and God. Samson wanted to be a part of this community of Philistines so bad. He wanted to marry this woman so bad, but he was called to do something different, to be something different. In fact, he was even called to fight against this very community. Now, despite Samson's desire to be a part of this community and to be accepted by him, it didn't make a difference. They hated him, no matter the fact that he desired to marry one of them, no matter that he threw this week-long feast where the Philistines were the ones invited, not his own people. No matter what Samson did, they were not going to accept him because of who he was. He was part of the people of God, and as such, he was an enemy. They may have pretended to like him for a time, but it was all just an act. On a human level, I totally understand Samson's desire to be accepted. As a man, I also understand the allure of a beautiful woman. That's why I married my wife. The truth of the matter is, no matter the decisions you make, there will always be people who will not accept you for one reason or another. You can bend over backwards and do everything they ask and try to fit in as much as you possibly can, but despite all of that, they may still turn on you just the same way they turned on Samson. Samson allowed his desire for acceptance and his lust for a beautiful woman to lead him down a path, while not downright sinful, was one of compromise. This is the wrong kind of compromise. We do not compromise when it comes to the things of God. Samson compromised his calling to deliver Israel from the Philistines by seeking to marry a Philistine simply because of his fleshly desires. Then he compromised on how he should have handled the lion carcass. While he didn't outright break his Nazirite vow, he was going against cleanliness standards given to all the Jews by God, simply because he wanted something sweet to eat. Neither of these choices were outright sinful, but it showed the heart of a man who was more concerned with his own desires than with what God had for him. Sure, he was willing to do what God called him to do, so long as it didn't inconvenience him too much or force him to give up something that he really wants. This mentality is going to get Samson into more and more trouble. And if you have this same mentality, it will get you in trouble as well. Samson sought acceptance from the world while he should have been seeking acceptance from God. The problem with seeking acceptance from the world is that you will never truly get it so long as you follow God in any capacity whatsoever. This is because the world is at odds with God. They may lie to you and make you think that so long as you ease up on just this thing or that thing, or you just give them a little bit, then they will accept you. It may start out seeming reasonable, but the truth of the matter is there will always be more that the world demands of you before they will accept you. Every step that you take away from God to make the world feel better about you is one more step away from God, and that step is never quite enough for the world. They'll tell you that if you just take this one step, then that'll be the last one and we're okay. But then they ask for another one. You need proof of this? Just look at how the church interacts with the LGBT community. First, the world tells the church, you just need to accept that these people exist. You may not agree with them, but they're allowed to do what they want. That's going to be okay. Do that. If you just accept that they exist and that they should be allowed to live the way that they want, we're going to be okay. So the church largely does that. But that wasn't enough. They want you to go further away from God's standard. Now it's they deserve all the same legal rights as a married couple. They should be treated the same. Okay, you want the same rights, we'll give it to you. We'll give you civil unions, and then you'll have all the same legal benefits as marriage. Then it becomes, we deserve to be married too. You don't own marriage. And in fact, your ministers should be forced to marry us. Then it's you have to celebrate us, not just tolerate us. Now it is becoming, you have to accept us into your church and even allow us to be pastors and leaders over you. I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I am making a moral statement. Anytime you compromise on a thing that God has commanded, even just a little, to appeal to the world, it is never enough. They will always want more, because in the end, their true desire is to get you to abandon your faith in God completely. They will never say that that's what they want. They just want to get rid of this problematic belief or that problematic belief. But let me tell you, the things they want to get rid of are all the standards that God has given us to live by. So instead of embarking on this fool's errand of seeking acceptance from the world, we should instead focus on seeking acceptance from our Father in heaven. His acceptance leads to blessing and being united with Him in eternity. Acceptance from the world means rejecting God, and that leads you to trouble, as Samson has discovered. And it's only going to get worse for him. And if you continue to seek acceptance from the world, it will only get worse for you too. If this is our goal, then instead of seeing just how much we can compromise without crossing the line, instead we need to draw nearer to God. Seeking acceptance from men leads you closer to the line of sin, which will inevitably lead to you crossing it. Seeking acceptance from God draws you closer and closer to Him, and thus further away from sin. I've spent too many years in my life trying to see just how close I can get to sin without actually touching it. But now I have come to a point in my life that I want to see just how far away I can get from sin. Not because I want to run away from sin, but because I want to run to God. It's not about what we're running away from, it's about what we're running toward. If you want to draw near to God, you must draw away from sin. If you are reaching this hand over and saying, I want to get as close to this sin that I love in my flesh as I can, you are naturally further away from God. Because God has no part of sin. So I want you to take on this challenge with me. Let's try to draw as near to God as we can. That means we've got to let go of those sins that entice us so much. We got to let go of those morally gray decisions that we like to make where, like, I'm not breaking the rules, I'm not sinning, but I'm definitely taking that little baby step closer. And as I get a little closer and a little closer and a little closer, then all of a sudden I look over and God's way over there. Guess what? God didn't move, you did. You moved away from Him by getting closer to sin. Let's draw near to God. Stop looking at the sin and trying to think, how close can I get to it without getting myself into trouble? You want to know how you end up with a big fall like Samson's coming to later in his life? It's not one big decision. It's a series of small decisions that lead you progressively further away from God and closer to your sin. That means to make that sin happen, it's a whole lot easier to do this and step into sin than it is to leap into sin when you're close to God. Had Samson been closer to God and further from his sin, maybe that big fall never happens. If you want to avoid sin in your life, if you want to avoid those big failures, the best way you can do that is by getting as close to God as you possibly can. And be willing to let go of that sin in your life. Be willing to let go of those little things that we do that aren't sinful, but they get you kind of close. Let us be wise and let us seek God with everything that we have. Let us let go of the things of the world and stop seeking acceptance there and instead concern ourselves solely and completely with the acceptance of God the Father. Let's pray. Father God, I love you. And Lord, let me draw nearer to you today than I was yesterday. Let's get out of this human mentality of I want to see just how close I can get to sin without actually stepping over into sin. Instead, I want to see just how close I can get to you. For the closer I get to you, the further I get away from my sin. The further I get away from the sin that grieves your spirit and breaks your heart. Lord, I love you, and I don't want to see your heart broken on account of me. I don't want to see your spirit grieved because I am dipping my toe into sin. So, Lord, I pray that I may be stirred up and like that fire in me that wants to see myself as close to you as possible. Give me the strength to let go of the sin that so easily entices. Give me the strength to walk away from those little decisions that seem so innocent by themselves, but just get me closer to that sin that entraps. Lord, grant me wisdom, grant me strength that I may draw nearer to you and further away from my sin. And I pray that for everyone who is listening to me here today, that they would take on that same prayer, so that we could start living for you and living ourselves concerned with your acceptance and not the world's. Because the world's acceptance leads to us turning our back on you. I don't want to turn my back on you. I want to draw as close to your presence as I can. So, Lord, I pray this and I ask this in your Son's mighty and precious name. Amen. I love you guys. Draw nearer to God. Seek his acceptance. Be willing to let go of the sin in your life. Be willing to walk away from the things that your flesh desires that you know only lead you into sin. I love you.